Again, I welcome you officially with the microphone in hand to our presentation today. We're going to be hearing a presentation about immigration in Missouri. This is brought to you by the library and by the League of Women Voters of Columbia, Boone County. If you're on Zoom, this is the housekeeping you need to go through. You're going to use the chat feature to ask your questions, and please be sure you select everyone so that everyone gets the chance to hear. And then later I'll walk around with the microphone so that also can be both the questions and the answers will be recorded. So, thank you so much.
I need the mic.
That's two. I'm gonna do one more silly thing today.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
So thank you, Jonia, for co-sponsoring with the Columbia Public Library, our Lunch and Learn programs. We really appreciate that. And today I'm really pleased to introduce Professor Jarod Roll from the Kinder Institute. And I'm really pleased he's agreed to join us and talk about or give us his insights and knowledge about immigration in Missouri. Just to give you a little background of what I researched on Professor Roll. He is a professor at the Kinder Institute on constitutional democracy and professor of Missouri history specifically, as well as constitutional history. Prior to joining the University of Missouri recently, he taught at the University of Mississippi and the University of Sussex in England. He's a native of Mount Vernon, Missouri. He received his BA from Missouri Southern State University in Joplin and his PhD in history from Northwestern University in Evanston, Illinois. And he specializes in modern United States labor and working class history with an emphasis on Missouri. His scholarship has focused on rural workers, both agricultural and industrial. And his teaching interests also include American political and social history from the Gilded Age to the Great Society, especially in the New Deal era. Wow. And he was honored to be chosen as a distinguished lecturer by the Organization of American Historians. And he also received the Missouri History Book Award from the State Historic Society of Missouri. So with that, I give you Professor Jarod Roll.
You'll hit the Alt tab. Alt tab. Otherwise, I have to get up there. It didn't do it. This is 3. Sorry, to be sure that everybody at home can see the slides. And I was told Alt tab. It's not working. Shall we just keep going forward?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay.
Let's roll it.
We're gonna roll.
You have your lapel mic? Yes.
Yeah, we're on. We're good. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Good afternoon. Thank you, Barbara. Thank you to the League of Women Voters for inviting me to be here today. It's an honor and a pleasure. Thank you to the library, Jonia, for hosting us. My first time in the building. I've only been in Columbia for about 7 weeks. So I am really delighted to be here today, here in Columbia, and back in the state of Missouri after 25 years away.
Wow.
And my parents are even happier. They're over the moon. They may be zooming in. I'm going to talk today about immigration to the United States in a broad sense, but use some examples from Missouri's history to illustrate that broader pattern, beginning in the early 1800s and working all the way up into more or less the present day. But as we know, the subject of immigration is not an easy one today or yesterday. or in the past 10 to 15 years. And if I have a main point today, that point is that the subject of immigration has rarely been an easy topic in the history of the United States. That's because it has always been central to the making of this country and what it means to be an American. Most of us have some direct connection to immigrants, directly as descendants, or perhaps we are immigrants ourselves. I have been an immigrant in the United Kingdom for work, so all of us have some pretty direct connection to immigration. And that's true whether we define immigrant broadly, as in anyone who came to live in the present day United States from elsewhere, right, at any time in the past, or if we define it more narrowly, as in those who arrived in the United States after its independence and formation as a country. In either case, the mass immigration of people to the United States since its founding has transformed the country and what it means to be American. As I said, I'm going to provide a broad overview of that process, beginning in the early 1800s, and offer examples from Missouri along the way. I'm going to be moving a little bit fast, touching on a lot of things, but please ask me about any and all of it in the question and answer period. Before we begin, I think it's worth pausing to think about what makes a person immigrate to a new country. Because, and I can speak for experience, moving to a new country is not easy, especially one across an ocean, far away from where one was born or raised. You say goodbye to familiar people, familiar landscapes, languages, religions, and not unimportantly, food. You say goodbye to the places that have shaped and defined your family, perhaps even saying goodbye to the graves of your parents and grandparents. It's not easy. While many immigrants to the United States have left their homes with the intention of returning one day, most did not. They left for good. What did they know about where they were going? The lucky ones had neighbors or family members who had already made the journey and who could relay advice and expectations. Others leapt into the relative dark with little clear idea of what awaited beyond perhaps what an advertisement promised at a train station. Maybe it promises jobs in Chicago. I'll try for that. Either way, the decision to immigrate was and remains a grave one. These individual and family decisions that make up the history of immigration are important and worthy of consideration. Scholars talk of two sets of immigration factors, push and pull. Push factors are trends or events that convince someone to leave a place. For example, economic crisis and overcrowding sparked Irish immigration to the United States in the early 19th century. Same with political conflict and repression in Germany in the 1840s. Similarly, we know that the persecution of Jews in the Russian Empire caused many to leave in the late 19th century. People tend to leave their homelands when their lives or their way of life is threatened and they see no hope or no future where they are. That's push factors. Pull factors are what attract people to a particular place. Where am I going to go? The United States has attracted immigrants because of its economic opportunities, its relative political freedom, its relative religious toleration, and because of, historically, its relatively open borders. Until the 1870s, immigrants could enter more or less freely. Taken together, these pull factors have made the United States an attractive destination, an attractive place for people to seek new lives, a new future. I want to note that these factors do not cover those who came to the United States through the slave trade. Generally speaking, enslaved people are considered forced migrants, not immigrants, because they're not choosing where they're going or when they're going, or that they're going at all. Right? They're not choosing what's happening to them. The topic of the slave trade and the forced labor of enslaved people is too important and complex for me to try to cram into this today. So I just want to acknowledge that at the beginning. And that too is a topic obviously worthy of study and attention. For the first 100 years of the United States, from the 1770s to the 1840s, I guess that's 70 years, I'm not a math major. Immigration into the country was relatively easy as the federal government permitted an essentially open border. Immigrants from Western Europe, especially Great Britain, which included Ireland as a British colony, France, Germany, and Scandinavia made up most of those who arrived. While many settled in eastern cities, many others moved west across the continent. These immigrants were central to the economic growth and expansion of the early United States. Immigrants have historically performed the hardest, lowest paying jobs. For example, Irish immigrants, between 10 and 20,000 of them, dug by hand the Erie Canal across New York State between 1817 and 1825. That Erie Canal linked New York to the Great Lakes, opening up the interior of the continent to trade and further immigration, made New York really the center of American capitalism in the 19th century. And it's done by Irish guys with shovels and pickaxes. Oh, slide.
Is your screen frozen?
No. He assured me this worked.
It did,
They did it. I did.
I've got a map to show you about German immigration into Missouri. German immigrants arriving in the 1830s and 40s.
Maybe just page down, can you do that?
I'm a Mac user too, so this is.
I don't know where the end these buttons on.
You could just go to the PowerPoint slide.
yeah, let's just do that.
Good, yeah.
Come on, do it.
Oh,
And then just go down one.
I've never
Okay.
come to that many of
You
these.
still sit up there.
Well, we sort of,
Flash from home.
So.
You keep going. I'm gonna call James.
Okay. German immigrants provided the labor that powered growing cities and turned Western lands recently taken from Native Americans into farms, especially the case in St. Louis and the eastern Missouri River Valley. Germans began arriving in St. Louis in the 1830s. They worked in all industries, but are perhaps most associated with winemaking and beer brewing. The Anheuser family, for example, first arrived in St. Louis in 1842 on their way to buy land for vineyards. They're actually winemakers, but launch one of the greatest breweries in American history, Anheuser-Busch. They also did plant those vineyards along the Missouri River Valley, which became known as the Missouri Rhineland, with Hermann, Missouri, at its center, where it remains today. Maybe some of you have done the vineyard tours around Hermann. That process begins with German immigration in the 1830s and 1840s. Federal law made it easy for these European immigrants to become United States citizens. The Naturalization Law of 1790 provided citizenship to, quote, free white persons and their children who lived in the country for at least 2 years. That's all. While the length of the residence requirement would change slightly over the years, this generous policy, at least concerning Europeans, defined the early nation's citizenship history or route to citizenship. Note that it explicitly applied to people considered white at the time, which essentially meant Western Europeans, people from Great Britain, people from France, people from Germany, people from Scandinavia. The citizenship of Black people, people of African descent, was resisted until finally denied for the moment in the infamous 1857 Dred Scott decision, which is also a Missouri story. Dred Scott was enslaved in Missouri. That does not mean that everyone welcomed the increasing numbers of non-English speaking people. Germans didn't speak English as a first language. As early as 1753, there we go. Thank you.
No, it's not there.
There we go. Okay,
Yay.
so we have, thank you very much. Magic. The top photograph is an early vineyard in the Missouri River Valley. This is a later 19th century ad from Anheuser-Busch in St. Louis. The pink areas on this map show the extent of German settlement in the 19th century, right, in the 1800s. You can see from St. Louis up the Missouri River Valley with smaller settlements around Cape Girardeau and south of Cape Girardeau. As early as 1753, Benjamin Franklin expressed anxiety about German immigration. He did not like that they maintained their own language, that they read German newspapers, that they worshiped in German, that they wanted to teach their children in German. Right? He thought this would make them unable to assimilate into American democracy because English-speaking Americans wouldn't be able to understand what they were saying and vice versa. The language barrier for Franklin was a problem. Irish immigrants attracted more abuse because of their relative poverty, fleeing a potato famine in the 1840s, and their Catholicism. Protestant Americans were fearful that Irish Catholics and all Catholics had a primary allegiance to the Pope in Rome, and that they would never be fully loyal Americans because of their subservience to the Vatican. That's a Protestant American view of the early 19th century. Irish immigrants bear the brunt of this growing anti-Catholicism. But note that Irish people could become US citizens under the law. The Naturalization Act of 1790 opened routes to Irish American citizenship. Irish immigrants were initially attracted to St. Louis in the 1820s because of its French influence and background. Both the Irish and the French hated the English. So the French hated the English, so the Irish liked the French. That's the place for me. Many more Irish people arrived in Missouri in the 1840s and 1850s. In St. Louis, they developed an Irish community in a section of the city called Dogtown. Right? Over time, however, English-speaking St. Louisans turned on their Irish neighbors, blaming them for everything from city fires that broke out to disease epidemics. Right? It must be the Irish. They're the cause of our problems. In the 1850s, this fear and anger toward Irish immigrants developed into political violence. 1854, a mob of as many as 5,000 people attacked Irish communities in Dogtown, setting fire to homes and businesses and Catholic churches. This was part of a broader national movement, a nativist movement a political movement seeking to purge the United States of foreign influence that was known as the Know Nothings, Know Nothingism. Know Nothing, if somebody asks you about it, I know nothing about that. Like, you deny association to a fairly secretive, purely anti-immigrant political movement in the 1850s. We have one of its symbols here in this flag. Beware of foreign influence. That 3 days of violence in St. Louis left 10 people dead and 100 businesses or homes owned or occupied by Irish immigrants completely destroyed. The mob wanted to destroy the old cathedral, right, which sits more or less across the street from the Dred Scott Courthouse in downtown St. Louis, but it was saved because they had a cannon in front of it. That the mob, they say know nothing, but they knew not to charge into the cannon. So the cannon saved the cathedral, now part of that kind of wonderful gateway to the west National Historic Park site in downtown St. Louis. By this point, 1840s, 1850s, many states were looking to restrict immigration themselves, and they're led by New York and Pennsylvania. And what they wanted to do was charge a head tax on newcomers. So new immigrants would have to pay a sum of money per person to enter the state. The Supreme Court struck down these state head taxes in 1849, which situated immigration law as purely a federal issue, rather than something that could be adjudicated, legislated by states. Obviously, you have all states with different immigration laws, the nation becomes chaotic and even more chaotic than ungovernable, put it that way. The 1850 federal census is the first time the US government recorded the nativity of its residents. So if you're in genealogy, that 1850 census is important because that's the first time you get country of origin, country of birth. At around the same time that immigration policy is becoming clearly a federal level issue, right? That 1849 Supreme Court ruling helps do that. In 1850, nearly 10% of people in the United States were foreign born, 10%. With Ireland and Germany leading the way, followed by Great Britain in third. Germans made up the largest group of foreign-born residents in Missouri. So Germans are the largest group in Missouri. The United States also absorbed or acquired foreign-born people in the 1840s and 1850s after the Mexican War with the Mexican Cession of 1848. Okay? So the United States goes to war against Mexico. This region, shaded here in pink, had previously been part of Mexico, becomes part of the United States as a result of the war. All or parts of New Mexico, Arizona, Colorado, Utah, Nevada, and California. All the inhabitants of those places are now under US jurisdiction, now on US territory. And so while there are debates about restricting immigrants from Europe, the United States is actually acquiring immigrants through territorial expansion. This will be a theme going into the 20th century. The 1850s also brought new immigrant groups to the West Coast for the first time, mainly in response to the California gold rush, right, which happens almost exactly at the moment the United States acquires California, that the richest gold deposits ever discovered anywhere in the world are found in California. It's a moment of really undeserved luck. For the first time, Chinese immigrants in large numbers arrived to work in California gold mines. They established communities throughout the West and supplied vital labor not only in gold mining, but Western coal mining, and perhaps most importantly, railroad construction. Chinese laborers built most of the railroads across the Western United States, linking those gold mines to eastern cities like Chicago, ultimately Kansas City and St. Louis. Okay? Chinese labor plays a huge role in this process, which added a new set of fears to Americans worried about immigration. Most white Americans found Chinese newcomers to be completely foreign, right? Different, seemed different in every way: appearance, religion, food, community practices. One of the biggest problems that Americans claimed was that Chinese immigrants actually worked too hard and could endure unusually harsh conditions. American workers believed that these were somehow innate racial traits, that Chinese workers were just somehow able to work much harder than everybody else, and that this made them unfair competition. It's unfair for us to be competing with Chinese workers who can naturally work much harder than we can. Kind of remarkable arguments people made. They argued that Chinese labor practices were and recruitment practices and their kind of work habits resembled slavery. Right? That Chinese workers were actually a different kind of enslaved labor competing with free American workers. In their view, Chinese people were too different to ever assimilate into the United States, that it was impossible. As a result, Americans, particularly white workers, demanded new laws to stop or limit Chinese immigration. In 1870, Congress passed a Naturalization Act that barred people, not quite to that slide yet, that barred people of Chinese descent from becoming citizens. 1870, US Congress bars people of Chinese descent from ever becoming citizens. At the same time, this bill formalized the citizenship of formerly enslaved people of African descent in the South. So it's an interesting give and take in this bill. Black people can become citizens, Chinese people can never be citizens. Same bill. And it's realizing the legislative, it's the legislative realization of the 14th Amendment's granting birthright citizenship. Right. That's the basis. Anyone born in the United States can become a US citizen. That's meant to ensure, to get around the Dred Scott decision and grant citizenship to the formerly enslaved. Right? But at the same time, they don't want to include everyone, so they're barring Chinese people from becoming citizens. 1870. Congress followed that bill up in 1875 with the first law designed to exclude particular groups of immigrants. This is known as the Page Act. It barred immigrants brought to the United States as forced labor, right? So it's targeting Chinese immigrants. It also barred women from entering the United States who were believed to be sex workers. They're also barred, singled out in this bill. Chinese workers and women who are believed to be on the judgment of an immigration official at the port of entry who is a man, always going to be a man in this period, of whether or not a woman is coming for immoral purposes. Right? First law to exclude immigrants, it has these two targets. In 1882, Congress went further by completely banning all immigration from China for 10 years in the Chinese Exclusion Act, 1882. So we see focus on Chinese immigration, 1870, 75, and then 1882, we get the Chinese Exclusion Act. Missouri's congressional delegation, you may be wondering, how did Missouri's elected delegates vote on the Chinese Exclusion Act? Unanimously in favor. Missouri's entire congressional delegation, House and Senate, unanimously in favor. The Chinese Exclusion Act was renewed twice. On the second time it was renewed, it was made permanent. And so the first bill's 10 years, it's renewed in 92, and then in 1902, it's made permanent. Okay. Meanwhile, immigrants from Southern and Eastern Europe began arriving on the East Coast in large numbers as war, religious persecution, and new transportation technologies pushed and pulled people to the United States. They hailed from Italy, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and the Russian Empire. To white Americans who descended from the English, Irish, and German, these people seemed very different. English was not their first language. They were Catholic, or they were Eastern Orthodox, or they were Jewish, and they were mostly poor. Between 1880 and 1910, the most intense period of mass immigration in this country's history, more than 7 million people would come to the United States, most from these so-called new immigrant groups, Southern and Eastern Europe. So, 1880 is right here. This is the sheer number of immigrants, right? From about 2 million upwards to 10 and 15 million. The orange line is the percentage immigrants as a percentage of the US population. 15% was kind of the high watermark, which we hit for the first time in 1880, 1890, 1910 with this new immigration from Eastern and Southern Europe. Today, we have just passed 15%. I'm going to return to that in this slide at the end. In 1892, the United States government built a new reception facility in New York Harbor to process these people. Ellis Island is constructed to process this unprecedented number of immigrants from Europe in the 1880s, 1890s. While all those who arrived underwent health checks and answered questions from immigration officials, they were mostly free to enter. Only 2% of arrivals were turned back, usually because they seemed sick or they seemed very poor, or the immigration official thought they were a risk of becoming a public charge. They wouldn't be able to work. The percentage of US residents who were born abroad would hover around 15% in these years, until recently the highest ever rate. These newcomers would provide much needed labor in the country's growing factories, its slaughterhouses, its mines, including in Missouri. Italians began arriving in St. Louis in large numbers in the 1880s and 1890s and created a thriving Little Italy neighborhood on the Hill. That begins in the 1880s and 1890s. This mass immigration caused many Americans who considered themselves to be old stock. We start getting this language, I'm an old stock American. I come from Great Britain. I come from France. Increasingly, I come from Germany. Kind of being mixed into what's considered old stock versus new stock. And the kind of cattle breeding language there is not incidental, right? There are people talking about racial heritage, genetic heritage, once we get into that level of scientific understanding. People who consider themselves old stock start demanding new restrictive laws. The American Protective Association, founded in 1887, and the Immigration Restriction League, founded in 1892, were among the largest of the political groups pushing for further restriction. They argued that the new immigrants were, quote, undesirable because of their poverty, their religion, their language, and again, the fear that they can never become Americans like we are Americans. Anti-Catholic arguments persist and are central to both of these restriction organizations. Meanwhile, immigrant groups, especially those in cities, began to organize politically themselves, particularly through the Democratic Party, which in cities prided itself on reaching out to common people, the urban poor, although not African Americans. particularly the Irish, become central to Democratic Party politics in cities. The same naturalization laws that allow people from Europe relatively free access to American citizenship mean they become US citizens and start to vote. In Kansas City, this leads to the election of a Democratic Party political machine rooted in the Irish neighborhood that becomes led by this man, Tom Pendergast. Right, becomes the boss of Kansas City in the early 20th century. He's not born in Ireland, but his parents are. Right? Son of Irish immigrants. And really his base is the West Bottoms neighborhood of Kansas City. Any neighborhood that's in the bottoms of anything is typically not fancy or wealthy or desirable. Right? It tells you a lot about who ends up there, the poorest, most vulnerable, and that is the Irish in Kansas City. These urban political machines are undemocratic, are corrupt, but they succeed by offering poor, vulnerable people certain protections in exchange for loyalty, kickbacks, money, and crucially votes. Immigration restrictionists, especially those in the Republican Party, pointed to machines like Pendergast's as evidence of the un-American ways of these immigrants. Okay, so already we have political struggle, not just in terms of ideals, but in terms of organized political groups battling over what immigration means about being American. Many immigration groups use their growing political power to resist the restrictionists. In St. Louis, for example, the central body of labor unions in the 1890s publicly opposed a bill to require literacy tests for entry into the country that the Immigration Restriction League had proposed. And so you've got labor unions in St. Louis, many of them immigrants, publicly clashing with the Immigration Restriction League over the shape of national legislation. For all immigrants, that birthright citizenship provision of the 14th Amendment, right, which is ratified in 1868, extended citizenship in theory to any of their children born on US soil. This was affirmed by the Supreme Court in 1898 in a case involving a man born to Chinese national parents in San Francisco. In a split decision, the court deemed Wong Kim Ark an American citizen. So it's kind of a crucial moment where birthright citizenship and the 14th Amendment, rooted in the Civil War and the fight against slavery, right, is now undermining efforts to restrict or limit Chinese immigration to the United States. So its application is now growing in 1898. And I think the Supreme Court justices who decided in favor of Wong Kim are really doing so against what they would really like to do. They would not to enable Chinese immigrants to become, their children to become US citizens. But their reading of the law, they end up overcoming that. And that is an important issue for us today. Right? The Supreme Court is going to be likely revisiting birthright citizenship in this current session, which started 2 days ago. So 1898, key moment there. 1898 is also a key year because the United States goes to war against Spain, right? The Spanish Empire, and defeats Spain. And in the process, gains new overseas territory, including Puerto Rico, Guam, and all of the Philippines become US territory after the Spanish-American War, which throws debates about citizenship into even further turmoil. What happens to the people in these places? Right? They're now on US soil. Are they US citizens? Do they have protections of the US Constitution? In 1901, the Supreme Court, maybe trying to make up for 1898, says no, they are not. They do not have full citizenship rights because their racial and cultural traits make them unsuitable for American citizenship. This is a series of cases known as the insular cases, and it has to do with if the US territory is an island, not connected to the mainland United States, and not fully organized as a territory, is it really in the jurisdiction of the United States? It's very tortured logic and decision-making in these cases. But the Supreme Court gives the United States power to rule over these people without their consent. Puerto Ricans eventually gained US citizenship in 1917, although they still lack full political equality today. Guamanians gained citizenship in the 1950s. Filipinos remained subjects until the Philippines became independent in 1946. Politics of immigration restriction gained momentum in the first decade of the 20th century, which saw 1 million or more people enter the country. In 1906, Congress passed an Expatriation Act, which stipulated that a woman automatically assumed the nationality of her husband upon marriage. That meant that American women who were citizens who married non-citizen men lost their citizenship. Yes, wild. Further evidence that the debates about citizenship and immigration are also about controlling women's behavior.
What year was that again?
1906. That affected many women in Missouri who had married German men who hadn't become US citizens. They became Germans overnight. At the same time, many people are starting to argue that immigration is good for the country. 1908 play, The Melting Pot, embodied this hope. But again, here, the idea is that the melting pot of the United States melts away the foreign influences and makes everyone into the same kind of homogeneous American. In many ways, playing into the hands of those who advocate restriction. World War I heightened tensions about immigrant loyalty. Many Americans worried that national loyalty would divide the nation between the two sides of the war. Many in the US advocated 100% Americanism, that is, no more Italian American, Irish American, just American. Once the war began, the US government began suppressing communities and newspapers in particular that seemed to harbor German influence. This hit hard in German Missouri. Germans are demonized, questioned, suspected of disloyalty. German language schools and newspapers were suppressed. Many of those German language newspapers in Missouri are forced to close. Cass and Lynn County leaders at one point pushed to end the use or make illegal the use of German on the telephone. Right, you couldn't speak German on the telephone because you might be fomenting subversion. New immigrant groups are also harassed during World War I. In 1917, native-born white Americans in Missouri's Lead Belt in eastern Missouri attacked miners born in Eastern Europe, driving entire communities, as many as 1,500 people, out of the central part of the state. They called it a hunky riot, using the derogatory term for someone of Slavic origin, Russians, Poles, Hungarians. 2 children who had been made homeless in those attacks later died of exposure in St. Louis, 1917. Missouri was a difficult place for these new immigrant groups in the 19-teens, as this suggests. The nation's leading anti-Catholic newspaper, called The Menace, was published in Aurora, Missouri, in my home county, and boasted hundreds of thousands of subscribers around the country. A whole newspaper, its only point is anti-Catholicism. That's all, the only thing that's in it, right? upwards of 800,000 subscribers around the United States in the 1910s. 1917, that same year, Congress passed an Immigration Act that created new barriers to entry, including a full literacy test, a head tax, exclusions on anyone who seemed to espouse radical political ideas, anyone who was mentally or physically disabled, an alcoholic, or a prostitute. The immigration agent had the power to determine these things. That act also banned all immigrants from all of the rest of Asia, from Turkey all the way to Korea, set up a new barred zone. No immigrants from those areas could enter the United States, dramatically expanding Chinese exclusion. That's 1970. Political leaders did not think this was exclusionary enough. In 1921, Congress passed the Emergency Quota Act, which set new limits for national groups each year in terms of who could come in, based on the number of people from those places in the 1910 census. Right, so you look at the numbers of the 1910 census, 3% of people from those places can enter. Only one senator voted against it, Missouri's James Reed, who's a Democrat from Kansas City. But he voted against it because he thought it was not restrictive enough. As you can tell, he seems unhappy. The Ku Klux Klan was a big supporter of this bill. Reed gets his way. 1924, Congress passes an even more restrictive act called the National Origins Act, which limited total immigration to the United States to 150,000 people per year, to be divided into national group quotas according to the population of those groups in the US in 1890. So moving the benchmark back 20 years, which cut out 20 years of new immigration to the United States. So it dramatically punished people from those nations. The quota for Italy, for example, dropped from 42,000 immigrants a year in 1921 to 3,800 a year in 1924. Hungary dropped from 5,600 to 400 per year. This bill effectively ended mass immigration to the United States. It also set up the modern visa system and established the modern border patrol. This 1924 act. It would define American immigration to 1965, right? For 41 years, this law is the main immigration law of the country. And over that period, the numbers of foreign-born people would fall steadily until 1970, when 4.7% of residents of the United States were born overseas, down from 15%. Congress did restore the citizenship of women who married a foreign national in 1922, the Cable Act. And one of the main advocates for the Cable Act was the League of Women Voters, who lead the push to end that ridiculous exclusion. League of Women Voters, it's the idea for it happens in St. Louis too. So its beginnings in many ways are in St. Louis. It's also a Missouri story. One significant loophole in the 24 Act, it did not include quotas for the Western Hemisphere. So it made it relatively easy for people from Mexico, Central America to immigrate into the United States. They just had to pay an entry fee. And their labor is in massive demand. With European immigration cut off, Mexicans are now relied upon to do the hard, dirty work, particularly in agriculture. Right. All across the West, in Texas, and increasingly into the Midwest. There are efforts in the 30s to stop the influx of Mexican immigration, but demand for them from agricultural businesses in particular is too great. American businesses will get cheap labor one way or another. The 24 law, however, had negative consequences for Jews seeking refuge or escape from Nazi atrocities in Europe. The few available national quotas quickly filled up. There was no way to get into the United States legally. This came to a head in 1939 when the ship St. Louis, which carried more than 900 Jews fleeing Nazi efforts to place them in concentration camps, was denied haven in the United States on the grounds that there were no national quotas. The ship returned to Europe. 254 of those passengers died in concentration camps. There are efforts after the war to loosen up immigration. Harry Truman signs the Displaced Persons Act in 1948, creating routes for refugees, displaced people from Europe to enter the country. The war also leads Congress to overturn the Chinese Exclusion Act in 1943. China had been a major ally against Japan. But the biggest change comes in 1965. Right. You can ask me about Japanese internment, right? Japanese American citizens interned because they are Japanese and considered foreign and an alien threat. 80 to 90,000 American citizens put in prison camps for 4 years during the war. Immigration bill signed by Lyndon Johnson in 1965 finally changed the basis of American immigration law, abolished the national quota systems, created routes of entry based on skilled labor and family unity or family reconstitution. This leads to finally an upturn in immigration numbers again. 1965 is right here. The percentage, foreign-born percentage of the US grows to the present day. The numbers of immigrants increases dramatically, and they're coming from new places altogether, Africa, Asia, making up this new wave of immigration into the United States. Until today, when we are again at about 15% of the nation born abroad, maybe a little bit more. We're at the highest level that the nation has ever seen. This process has reshaped Missouri, but in more limited ways than other states. Today, the state's population is about 5% foreign born. Most of these groups come from Mexico, India, and China. Missouri's also become home to significant refugee populations, which are expanded in the Cold War, beginning with people from Southeast Asia in the 1980s, people from the Balkans, particularly Bosnia, in the 1990s. Recently, the largest groups of refugees arrived in the state, or until recently, Congo, Afghanistan, Somalia, and Syria. Rural Missouri remains overwhelmingly native-born and white, except, of course, where Mexican labor is needed, like on the huge sod farms 2 miles from my parents' house in Lawrence County, Missouri. History of immigration to the United States is the history of what makes an American. It's contested today, it has been for a long time. The country has always needed immigrant labor, doing everything from building railroads and digging canals to roofing houses and performing medical services, medical care. Groups once considered dangerous have now become celebrated in Missouri. Hermann, Missouri, there's a big billboard on I-70, says, "Welcome." Right, we're using German again to welcome people to Hermann. In the 19-teens, that would not have happened. Or you could go to the Ernefest in Freistadt, which is 5 miles west of my parents' house, and drink a lot of beer. And as it says there, come and get your German on. Or consider how St. Louis is, its key symbols now are a special kind of pizza, which I happen to like, and a special kind of ravioli, which I happen to like. Gifts from Italian immigrants. But Americans today are confused, I think, about whether immigration is good or bad or what it means. I'm just reading an article this morning, 79% of Americans believe immigration is good. But the nation is split on whether or not the country is welcoming of immigrants, like 49 to 49. Do we welcome immigrants? Do we not welcome immigrants? The key question to me seems to be Are the ideals of this country, as embedded in our constitutional order and rights of citizens, strong enough to support a nation of people from diverse backgrounds or not? History can tell us the way Americans answered this question in the past. How Americans answer the question in the future remains to be determined. Thank you.
Can I ask a question?
Yes, please.
One quick question. Is there a country does immigration with respect to their citizens and to the immigrants? Like, I'm looking for a model. I'm not sure the US is currently a model.
Ireland remains an inviting and honors immigrants. And is a nation that considers itself an ally of people in need of another home, based in large part on the history of Irish people themselves abroad. Elsewhere in Europe, however, and around the world, we are entering a period of where immigration restriction politics are extremely popular. But I think Ireland, if you're looking for a model, is worth looking further at.
We do have an online. Can you all hear me okay? I'm not hearing myself, so. Do you want me to read that out, Sharon? Okay.
How does Missouri respond to the RACERO, RACERO program back in 1940 that attracted Mexican laborers by providing working visas?
There are braceros. The bracero program provides a temporary visas, work visas for Mexican immigrants into seasonal agriculture fields. It's most popular in Texas and the West, where you get big corporate farms. But there are limited numbers of Mexican immigrants on bracero visas working in Missouri in the 1940s and 1950s. As that program comes to an end, though, we get the Eisenhower administration's what's unfortunately called Operation Wetback, a period in 54 and 55 where hundreds of thousands of Mexican immigrants are loaded onto trucks and shipped back to Mexico. Many of them, or not many of them, some of them actually American citizens. Yeah. So Missouri farmers are happy to get cheap labor that Mexican workers provide.
I've got one more question. Do we have any ways to show that immigration is connected to climate change?
I think today, yes. I mean, we get people
But it's
leaving.
been consistently, on your graph, 15%,
Yeah, I mean, I think people, the last 5 years has seen an unprecedented attempts by people to move worldwide, not just to the United States, but many people moving because of the failure of traditional economies, agricultural systems that we can link to climate change, that one way or another ends up in Europe or ends up in the United States. Yeah, and I think I'm a historian, but if we're looking at the future, I think that is going to be a major cause, a major push factor for a lot of people seeking survival or more habitable places.
I'm wondering whether the anti-immigrant sentiment in the United States does it correlate with economic conditions in the United States?
In some ways, yes. Yeah. In the late 19th century, the national economy was swung wildly between periods of growth and periods of contraction. ending in the 1890s, what was considered the Great Depression before the next Great Depression. At the time, it was the Great Depression, which corresponds to the high levels of immigration from Europe. And I think that's certainly where you start to see working class Americans becoming more sympathetic to anti-immigrant politics when jobs, pay are not as good as they have been, and they consider themselves under threat from foreign workers arriving. But I don't think it's a direct causal correlation. I think the ethnic, religious background of immigrant groups, which isn't connected necessarily to economic conditions, also powerfully informs anti-immigrant politics.
Is there anything that distinguishes the current anti-immigrant stance in politics from what existed in the 1840s, 50s, the 1920s? Is there anything you as a historian see that makes this moment different or distinguishable from those prior times? Thank you.
That's a good question. I would say that the broad patterns are very similar to what we've seen before. I think it's interesting how people from newer immigrant groups often find their voices in support of immigration restriction.
Yeah.
And the way but that's also kind of a repeating cycle. I think the way in which the immigration legislation, or like the way the government manages immigration, has become kind of paralyzed over the last 40 years, not really since the 1980s. Have we had a major overhaul of American immigration policy? And the way that's deadlocked politically, like neither party just can't get any action on it, despite people having all these ideas and claims about it. That may be different to have such a long period of political, of ineffectual policy from Washington, D.C. about immigration law. Like, can we do this better? Why can't we pass a law that does it better? That in some ways is different, I think. In previous areas, for good or bad, the federal government has been able to act decisively to manage immigration in large part. That doesn't seem to be the case today.
This last question is related to what you're talking about right here.
Have we seen a history of forcibly and violent deportations as we are seeing with ICE right now? Yes. Yes. We've seen that in Eisenhower's Operation I hate saying it, Operation Wetback, right? In the 1950s. There were similarly violent deportations of Mexican immigrants in the 1930s and under the Hoover administration. After World War I, people were rounded up and deported based on political ideas, right? People who were anarchists or socialists and not American citizens were arrested, put on ships and sent to the Soviet Union in 1919, even though they weren't Russian. Certainly we've seen large patterns of vigilante violence against immigrant groups considered a threat. Ku Klux Klan in the 1920s had 5 million members nationwide, one of the largest political groups in the country. That's all about policing a restrictive version of Americanism as white, Protestant, native born, and they use violence. Often seem to get a nod and approval from Congress with the Immigration Restriction Acts, where they seem to think they're acting as kind of quasi-government agents or officials. That's not to say today's situation is entirely repeating the past. Future historians will have more to say.
So before we We thank you. Was amazing, this background and history that I think is really relevant for today. And I know you've written many books. Is there one particular book that you would recommend for more information? I mean, I wrote 4.5 pages of notes, but I know I missed some things.
In terms of information or one of my books?
Yeah, one of your books.
Can I?
Yeah,
Yeah.
one of your books.
Okay.
What your book?
My most recent book is called Poor Man's Fortune. And it's a history of white working class conservatism in metal mining. And it focuses on the lead and zinc mining district of Southwest Missouri, Southeast Kansas, Northeast Oklahoma. It is always available for free in digital formats. You don't have to buy it. It's on Amazon, any major,
Library,
the library, yeah.
hopefully.
Digital platform, you can access it for free digitally, so you don't have to buy it.
And my second related question is, can we, any of us, if we're interested, sign up for one of your classes?
Yeah, absolutely.
So just go to the
Yes.
Kinder Institute. Yeah, I found this absolutely fascinating, so please give a round. And it's really, really, really helpful. So thank you so much, and I want to announce that our Lunch and Learn for next month is November 12th. And that one will be on ethics in government. And our city councilor attorney, Nancy Thompson, will be here to talk about what ethics rules we have for the city operation, and why it's needed and why it's important. So see you all next month, hopefully. Thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone.